We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here. I need to see some ID.
I live here. I'm literally washing my car in my own driveway.
Just cooperate and we'll be done here.
You're really gonna do this?
Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm Sergeant Darnell Whitmore. I'm sure you recognize my name. Now I need your badge number because you're in big trouble.
The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, Officer Trevor Castellano's entire world collapsed. The man he had just told to cooperate, the person he had profiled as someone who didn't look like they belonged, was not just a citizen. He was a 15-year veteran of the police department. He was a decorated sergeant, and as of 3 weeks ago, he was Castellano's direct supervisor in the East Division Patrol Unit. This wasn't going to be a routine call that Castellano could write up and forget about. This was going to be a career-ending encounter that would be studied in police academies for years to come. And Castellano's own body camera was recording every single word. Trevor Castellano had been with the police department for 4 years. He was 28 years old, married, and considered himself a good cop. He had grown up in a mostly white suburban area about 30 miles from the city where he now worked. His father had been a police officer, and Castellano had always wanted to follow in his footsteps. He had gone through the police academy, graduated in the middle of his class, and been assigned to the East Division. His record showed 14 commendations for good police work. He had made several solid arrests, helped with community events, and his supervisors had always rated him as competent. But there was something else in Castellano's file that hadn't been addressed. Over his 4 years, he had received 9 complaints from citizens alleging racial profiling or inappropriate conduct. All 9 complaints had come from Black or Latino residents. All 9 had been investigated and marked as unfounded or unsubstantiated. The complaints had been investigated by his previous supervisor, Lieutenant Vernon Kowalski, who was known for protecting his officers and dismissing most civilian complaints as people trying to get out of legitimate police work. Kowalski had retired 6 months ago. The new supervisor for Castellano's unit was someone from another division, someone Castellano had never worked with before. That supervisor was Darnell Whitmore. Darnell Whitmore was 38 years old and had been with the department for 15 years. He had started as a patrol officer, worked his way up to detective, and then moved into supervision. He had an exemplary record, 2 Medal of Valor commendations for actions under fire, dozens of successful investigations, a reputation for being tough but fair. He had also spent the last 5 years living in the Riverside neighborhood, one of the nicer areas in the city. His house was a well-maintained 3-bedroom craftsman-style home with a detached garage and a small front yard. The neighborhood was predominantly white, upper middle class, and quiet. Whitmore had moved there with his wife and 2 daughters. He loved the neighborhood. Good schools, low crime, friendly neighbors. He had introduced himself to everyone on the block when he moved in. Most of them were welcoming. A few seemed surprised that a Black family was moving into the area, but Whitmore had experienced that before. He focused on being a good neighbor and didn't worry about the rest. That Saturday morning in November, Whitmore had the day off. He decided to wash his car, a dark blue sedan that needed a good cleaning after a week of rain. He pulled the car into the driveway, got out his bucket and sponge, and started washing. The weather was perfect. Temperature in the mid-60s, sunny, light breeze. Whitmore was wearing jeans, a gray t-shirt, and old sneakers. He had his earbuds in, listening to music while he worked. He was completely relaxed, enjoying his day off, thinking about taking his daughters to the park later. He never heard the patrol car pull up behind him. Castellano had been cruising through the Riverside neighborhood on routine patrol when he got a call on his radio. Dispatch said they had received a report of a suspicious person in the 2400 block of Maple Street. The caller, who remained anonymous, said there was a Black male acting suspiciously around vehicles. Castellano responded that he would check it out. He drove to Maple Street and started looking for anyone who fit the description. That's when he saw Whitmore in the driveway, washing a car. Castellano made several assumptions in rapid succession. First, he assumed Whitmore didn't live there. The neighborhood was too nice, too expensive. Second, he assumed Whitmore might be casing cars to break into. Third, he assumed this must be the suspicious person the caller had reported. Castellano never considered that Whitmore might actually live in the house. He never considered that washing a car in your own driveway on a Saturday morning is the opposite of suspicious. He never considered calling dispatch to get more details about the complaint. He just got out of his patrol car and approached with his hand resting on his service weapon. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that expose the reality of racial profiling, even within law enforcement, please hit that subscribe button right now. What happens next will shock you. Whitmore didn't notice Castellano approaching until the officer was about 10 feet away. He pulled out one earbud and turned around. That's when he saw a uniformed officer walking toward him with a serious expression and a hand on his service weapon. Whitmore's first thought was that something had happened in the neighborhood, maybe a break-in, maybe an accident. He turned off the hose and walked toward Castellano, expecting a professional interaction between two law enforcement officers, even though Castellano didn't know who he was yet. But Castellano's first words weren't professional. They were an accusation wrapped in a demand. He said they got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here, and he needed to see some ID. Whitmore felt the statement land like a punch. Someone who didn't look like they belonged. Not someone doing something suspicious. Not someone matching a description of criminal activity. Just someone who didn't look like they belonged in this neighborhood. Whitmore kept his voice calm and stated the obvious. He lived here. He was literally washing his car in his own driveway. It was a simple statement of fact that should have ended the encounter immediately. But Castellano didn't apologize, didn't step back, didn't reconsider. He just told Whitmore to cooperate and they'd be done here, as if Whitmore was the one being difficult, as if simply existing as a black man in a white neighborhood required cooperation with police demands. Whitmore asked the question that hung in the air. You're really going to do this? It wasn't just a question about the ID demand. It was a question about whether Castellano was really going to engage in obvious racial profiling, whether he was really going to stop someone for no reason other than race. Castellano's response confirmed everything. He told Whitmore not to make this harder than it needed to be. The implication was clear. Submit, don't question, don't assert your rights. Just comply with whatever a police officer demands, legal basis or not. That's when Whitmore made his decision. He identified himself, stated his name, his rank, added that he was sure Castellano recognized the name, though from the look on Castellano's face, he clearly didn't. Then Whitmore asked for Castellano's badge number and informed him he was in big trouble. You could see it in the body camera footage. Castellano's face went from confident authority to absolute shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand dropped from where it had been resting near his weapon. He took an involuntary step backward. Whitmore let the silence hang for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. He asked Castellano for his badge number. Castellano, still in shock, stammered out 2847. Whitmore then asked Castellano to explain in detail what reasonable suspicion he had to stop someone washing a car in their own driveway. What exactly about the call justified this stop? Castellano tried to recover. He said he got a call about someone who looked suspicious. Whitmore asked what the call said specifically. Castellano repeated that someone didn't look like they belonged. Whitmore pressed harder. What made them suspicious? What criminal activity was reported? Castellano had no answer that didn't involve racial profiling. He hadn't been told about any crime. He hadn't observed any suspicious behavior. He had simply been told someone didn't look like they belonged, and he had seen a black man washing a car. Whitmore asked if Castellano had verified the address of the complaint. Castellano hadn't. Whitmore asked if Castellano had called for any additional information from dispatch. Castellano hadn't. Whitmore asked if Castellano had observed any actual criminal behavior before approaching. Castellano hadn't. Whitmore then asked a question that would become central to the investigation that followed. He asked Castellano if the only reason for the stop was the fact that Whitmore was a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. Was that what didn't look like they belonged actually meant? Castellano tried to deny it. He said it wasn't about race, it was about responding to a call. Someone reported a suspicious person. Whitmore pressed. What was suspicious? The caller said someone didn't look like they belonged. Castellano couldn't explain how that translated to reasonable suspicion without admitting it was purely about race. Castellano tried to pivot. He said Whitmore should just cooperate and this would be over. Whitmore's response was ice cold. He pointed out that just cooperate wasn't a legal standard for detaining someone. Officers need reasonable suspicion. Castellano still couldn't articulate any. The interaction lasted another 6 minutes. Whitmore methodically walked Castellano through every mistake he had made, every assumption, every policy violation, every constitutional issue. He explained that didn't look like they belonged is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. He explained that being black in a white neighborhood is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. He explained that anonymous calls without specific criminal activity do not justify stops without independent verification. Quick question for you watching. If you've ever been profiled by police, even though you were doing nothing wrong, type "it happens" in the comments. Let's show how common this really is. Castellano tried several tactics to minimize what he had done. He said he was just following up on a call, doing his job. Whitmore pointed out that doing your job means investigating properly, not making assumptions based on race. Castellano said the caller seemed concerned. Whitmore asked what specific concern was mentioned. Castellano couldn't provide one beyond someone not belonging. Castellano said Whitmore should understand, cop to cop, that sometimes you have to make quick judgments. Whitmore said that quick judgments based on nothing but race are still racial profiling and still unconstitutional, cop or not. By the end of the interaction, Castellano knew he was in serious trouble. Whitmore told him to return to the station and report immediately to the watch commander. Whitmore said he would be filing a formal complaint and initiating an internal investigation. Castellano's body camera had captured everything, and Whitmore had also recorded the interaction on his personal phone. Castellano drove back to the station in a state of shock. He had just threatened to arrest his own sergeant. He had engaged in obvious racial profiling, and it was all documented. There was no way to explain this away. When Castellano arrived at the station, the watch commander was already waiting for him. Word had spread fast. Whitmore had called ahead. Castellano was immediately placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His badge and gun were taken. He was sent home with instructions not to discuss the case with anyone. The investigation began that same day. Internal Affairs assigned 2 senior investigators. They reviewed Castellano's body camera footage first. The video was damning. You could hear Castellano's exact words. "We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here." You could hear Whitmore calmly explaining that he lived there and was washing his car in his own driveway. You could hear Castellano telling him to just cooperate without any legal justification. The audio captured Whitmore's controlled anger when he asked, "You're really going to do this?" And it captured the moment everything changed, when Whitmore identified himself as Sergeant Darnell Whitmore and told Castellano he was in big trouble. They pulled Castellano's personnel file and found the 9 previous complaints. Now they had context. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern that had been ignored. They interviewed Whitmore in detail. Whitmore provided a thorough statement. He explained that he had experienced profiling before as a civilian, but experiencing it from one of his own officers while off duty was particularly disturbing. He said it raised serious questions about Castellano's judgment and whether he had been engaging in racial profiling throughout his career. The investigators interviewed Castellano 3 days after the incident. Castellano tried to defend his actions. He said he was responding to a legitimate call. When investigators pointed out that the call gave no specific location and no description beyond black male, Castellano said he had to make a judgment call. Investigators asked why he assumed Whitmore was the person from the call when Whitmore was clearly washing a car in a residential driveway. Castellano said the caller reported someone who didn't look like they belonged. When pressed on what that actually meant, Castellano couldn't articulate anything that didn't come down to race. They asked Castellano what he meant when he told Whitmore to just cooperate. Castellano said he was trying to de-escalate. Investigators pointed out that demanding ID without legal justification isn't de-escalation, it's escalation. It's a violation of rights. They asked Castellano if he had known Whitmore was a sergeant when he approached. Castellano said no. They asked if that would have changed his approach. Castellano said probably. That answer was revealing. It meant Castellano would have treated a white homeowner differently than he treated Whitmore. It meant his approach was based on assumptions about who belonged in the neighborhood, not on actual suspicious behavior. The investigators reviewed the original call to dispatch. The anonymous caller had simply said there was a black male on Maple Street who didn't look like he belonged and was acting suspicious around cars. The caller didn't give a specific address, didn't describe any criminal behavior, didn't provide any details beyond race, a vague location, and the loaded phrase, "didn't look like he belonged." It was, in other words, a perfect example of the kind of racially motivated call that officers are trained to investigate carefully rather than act on immediately. Anonymous calls using phrases like "doesn't belong" combined with racial descriptions and no specific criminal activity are often from people with bias who see any person of color in their neighborhood as inherently suspicious. Castellano should have called for more information, should have observed before approaching, should have looked for actual criminal behavior. Instead, he saw a black man and assumed he was the problem. The investigators also found something else troubling. They pulled dispatch records for Castellano's entire 4-year career and found a pattern. Castellano had responded to calls about suspicious persons at a rate 40% higher than other officers in his district, and 87% of those calls had involved people of color. Either Castellano was assigned to an area with legitimately more suspicious activity by people of color, or Castellano was actively seeking out calls that allowed him to stop people of color. The data suggested the latter. Do you think the department should have caught this pattern earlier? Let me know what you think in the comments. The investigation took 7 weeks. During that time, investigators conducted 23 interviews, reviewed 14 hours of body camera footage from Castellano's previous stops, and analyzed 4 years of dispatch records and incident reports. The findings were unequivocal. Castellano had violated department policy on racial profiling. He had conducted an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion. He had failed to properly investigate before approaching a citizen. He had made assumptions based on race rather than behavior. But the investigation uncovered something much larger than a single incident. Investigators tracked down the 9 individuals who had filed previous complaints against Castellano. 8 of them agreed to be interviewed. Their stories were remarkably consistent. A 45-year-old black attorney named Jerome Buckley described being stopped by Castellano while jogging in a park near his home. Castellano had demanded ID and asked what Buckley was doing in the area. Buckley explained he lived nearby and ran there 3 times a week. Castellano had made him wait while he ran Buckley's ID for warrants. There were none. Castellano let him go without explanation or apology. A 32-year-old Latina small business owner named Elena Fuentes recounted being stopped by Castellano while loading equipment into her van outside her own store. Castellano had accused her of stealing and demanded to see receipts for the equipment. Fuentes owned the store and the equipment was hers. She showed Castellano her business license. Castellano claimed he was just being thorough. Fuentes filed a complaint. It was marked unfounded. A 19-year-old black college student named Tyrell Washington described being stopped by Castellano while walking home from class at 8 p.m. Castellano asked where he was going, where he had been, and why he was in that neighborhood. Washington explained he was a student who lived 3 blocks away. Castellano made him empty his backpack on the sidewalk. Washington filed a complaint. It was investigated by Lieutenant Kowalski and dismissed as a lawful investigative stop. The pattern was undeniable. Castellano consistently stopped people of color in situations that didn't warrant stops. He consistently demanded identification without legal justification. He consistently assumed people of color were out of place in certain neighborhoods. More importantly, the investigation concluded that Castellano's 9 previous complaints should have been taken more seriously. A pattern review showed that all 9 complaints described similar behavior. Castellano assuming people of color didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. Castellano demanding ID without legal justification. Castellano being aggressive in situations that didn't warrant aggression. The investigation also revealed that Lieutenant Kowalski had been deliberately vague in his investigations of Castellano's complaints. Kowalski's reports used phrases like "officer was conducting legitimate police work" and "complainant misunderstood standard procedures," without actually examining whether the stops met constitutional standards. In 3 cases, Kowalski hadn't even interviewed Castellano before closing the complaint as unfounded. He had simply reviewed Castellano's incident report and accepted it at face value. In 2 other cases, Kowalski had interviewed Castellano but hadn't asked any challenging questions about why the stop was made or whether racial bias might have been a factor. The previous supervisor had failed to identify the pattern, or worse, had identified it and chose to ignore it. The investigators noted in their report that Kowalski's failure to properly supervise Castellano had allowed a problematic officer to continue violating citizens' rights for years. The recommendation was termination. Castellano's union fought it, arguing that he had been responding to a legitimate call and that his actions, while perhaps overly aggressive, didn't rise to the level of termination. The department's response was simple. Castellano had profiled a sergeant based on race. If he would do that to a superior officer, what was he doing to regular citizens who didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back? The union's argument failed. Castellano was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. His appeal was denied. His law enforcement career was over at age 28. But the consequences went beyond just Castellano. The department launched a comprehensive review of how civilian complaints were handled. They found that under the previous supervisor, Lieutenant Kowalski, complaint investigations had been cursory at best. The review examined 127 complaints that Kowalski had investigated over his final 5 years as a supervisor. Of those, 94 alleged some form of discrimination or excessive force. Kowalski had found merit in only 3. The rest were dismissed as unfounded, unsubstantiated, or complainant withdrew. But when Internal Affairs re-examined 30 of those complaints with access to body camera footage and dispatch records that Kowalski hadn't reviewed, they found patterns of problematic behavior in 18 cases. Officers making stops without reasonable suspicion. Officers using force in situations that didn't warrant it. Officers making racially coded comments. Kowalski's failure to investigate properly hadn't just protected Castellano. It had protected multiple officers whose conduct needed to be addressed. The department published a scathing report criticizing Kowalski's supervision and noting that his failure to properly investigate complaints had allowed problematic behavior to continue unchecked throughout his division. Kowalski had retired 6 months before the Whitmore incident, so he couldn't be disciplined. But the department stripped him of his retirement ceremony honors and made it clear that his legacy would be one of failed leadership. Several community leaders called for Kowalski to return his pension, though legally that wasn't possible. The department also implemented sweeping new protocols based on what the investigation had revealed. All complaints alleging racial profiling would be investigated by Internal Affairs, not by division supervisors, eliminating the conflict of interest that had allowed Kowalski to protect his officers. All stops would be reviewed quarterly for patterns of racial disparity. The department hired a data analyst whose sole job was to track stop data, looking for officers whose stops showed racial disparities that couldn't be explained by legitimate factors. All body camera footage from investigatory stops would be randomly audited to ensure officers were following proper procedures. 5% of all stops each month would be pulled at random and reviewed by a team of supervisors and community representatives. The department created a civilian review board with actual power. Previous civilian oversight had been advisory only. The new board could compel testimony, access all records, and make binding recommendations on discipline for sustained complaints. Officers were required to complete 16 hours of implicit bias training annually, not the previous 2-hour online module that officers could click through without paying attention. The new training was in-person, interactive, and included scenarios designed to make officers confront their own biases. The department also established an early warning system that would flag officers who showed patterns of problematic behavior before it rose to the level of sustained complaints. If an officer had 3 complaints alleging similar conduct within a year, even if none were sustained, they would be automatically flagged for additional supervision and training. Whitmore was involved in developing the new training program on implicit bias and racial profiling. He shared his own experience with the body camera footage as a training example. Officers watched a respected sergeant get profiled by one of their own. It was powerful and uncomfortable, which was exactly the point. The training didn't just show Whitmore's incident, it showed the body camera footage from several of Castellano's previous stops. Officers watched Castellano stop the attorney while jogging. They watched him harass the business owner outside her own store. They watched him make a college student empty his backpack. Then, trainers asked the officers to identify what reasonable suspicion Castellano had in each case. The answer was always the same: none. The only common factor was the race of the person being stopped. Whitmore also became an advocate for officers of color within the department. He discovered that he wasn't the only black officer who had experienced discrimination. Several others shared stories of being stopped by fellow officers while off duty, being questioned about why they were in certain neighborhoods, being assumed to be suspects rather than officers. Whitmore started a mentoring program pairing experienced officers of color with newer recruits. He worked with command staff to address issues of discrimination and bias within the ranks. He pushed for more diversity in hiring and promotion. The incident had revealed that these problems existed even among those sworn to protect and serve, and Whitmore was determined to change that culture. Castellano's termination attracted media attention. Local news covered the story of an officer fired for profiling his own sergeant. The story went viral on social media. The body camera footage was released after the investigation concluded, and it was viewed millions of times. Comments sections filled with people sharing their own experiences of being profiled. Black professionals who had been stopped in their own neighborhoods. Latino business owners questioned in their own stores. Asian Americans followed by security in high-end shops. The story resonated because it showed that profiling happens to everyone, regardless of education, profession, or status. Even a decorated police sergeant wasn't immune to being treated as suspicious simply for being black in a white neighborhood. Castellano gave one interview after his termination. He said he felt he had been treated unfairly, that he had been responding to a call and doing his job. When asked if he understood why Whitmore had been offended, Castellano gave a halting answer that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the problem. He never apologized to Whitmore, not privately, not publicly. He moved out of state 6 months later and took a job in construction. His wife filed for divorce, citing the stress of the termination and her husband's inability to take responsibility for his actions. Whitmore continued to serve as a sergeant. 3 years after the incident, he was promoted to lieutenant. He's now a respected voice in the department on issues of community relations and fair policing. The house on Maple Street is still his home. He still washes his car in the driveway on Saturday mornings. But now, when patrol officers drive by, they wave. They know who he is. They know what happened. And they know that assumptions based on race have consequences. The incident became a case study in how racial profiling operates even within institutions that should know better. It showed that having policies against discrimination isn't enough if those policies aren't enforced. It showed that complaints need to be taken seriously and patterns need to be identified. Most importantly, it showed that racial profiling doesn't just hurt the people being profiled. It erodes trust in law enforcement, damages departments' reputations, and ends the careers of officers who let bias override their judgment. Marcus Whitmore washing his car that Saturday morning was doing exactly what millions of people do every weekend. The only thing that made him suspicious was the color of his skin, and the officer who couldn't see past that lost everything. The lesson is simple but profound. When you assume someone doesn't belong based on their race, when you approach them with suspicion based on nothing but appearance, when you let bias dictate your actions instead of facts, you're not doing good police work. You're engaging in discrimination. And eventually, whether the person you're profiling is a sergeant, a lawyer, a teacher, or just a regular citizen trying to live their life, the truth comes out. The pattern becomes undeniable. The consequences become real. Castellano thought he was investigating a suspicious person. What he was actually doing was revealing his own biases. He thought his badge gave him the authority to demand ID from anyone who looked out of place to him. What he learned was that looking out of place based on race is not reasonable suspicion. The body camera footage from that November morning is still used in training sessions across the country, not just in police departments, but in discussions about implicit bias, racial profiling, and the importance of examining our own assumptions. Every time someone watches that video, they see the exact moment an officer's career ends. They see his face when he realizes the man he was profiling is his supervisor. They hear the excuses fall apart. They witness accountability in action. If this story opened your eyes to how racial profiling works, even within law enforcement, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and hold people accountable. Drop a comment and tell me what you learned from this. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to see them. Thanks for watching until the end.